October 31st, 2000 started like any other autumn day in Taiwan. The bustling city of Taipei, with its gleaming skyscrapers and colorful street markets, hummed with the usual energy. Little did anyone know, the world was about to be shaken by one of the most tragic aviation disasters of the 21st century. Singapore Airlines Flight 006, a long-haul international flight bound for Singapore, was scheduled to take off from Taiwan's Taoyuan International Airport. Aboard the aircraft were 179 passengers and crew members, many of whom were returning home or embarking on new adventures. But as the flight pushed back from the gate and taxied down the runway, a fatal series of miscommunications, human errors, and unforeseen circumstances culminated in a catastrophic crash. What happened that night would forever change the way aviation authorities viewed runway safety, crew communication, and the importance of thorough cross-checking. It would also leave an indelible mark on the families of the victims, as well as the survivors who would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006, the crash, and the lessons learned from an unimaginable tragedy. Singapore Airlines, widely regarded as one of the world's top carriers, was known for its impeccable safety record and modern fleet of aircraft. Flight 006 was scheduled to depart from Taipei's Taoyuan International Airport, TP, at 11:40 p.m. local time on October 31st, 2000, bound for Singapore Changi Airport, SIN. On board was a crew of seasoned flight attendants and experienced pilots, as well as a mix of business travelers, tourists, and expatriates. Most of the passengers were citizens of Singapore, the United States, and other countries in the region. The flight crew consisted of Captain Ching Lun Seng, a 44-year-old veteran with more than 17 years of flying experience. First Officer Ho Weng Kien, a 39-year-old with extensive flight hours, and Flight Engineer Tan Chiang, 42. The crew had just completed a series of pre-flight checks and were preparing for the usual routine takeoff. But something was amiss on that night. The airport was undergoing construction work on runway 05, which had forced the diversion of flights to runway 10 right, which was in the opposite direction. The runway construction was poorly lit, and runway markings were not clearly visible in the dark, adding to the confusion for pilots and ground control staff. But there was something more, something no one could have predicted. It was the confluence of several critical errors that would set the stage for one of the most catastrophic crashes in aviation history. As Flight 006 prepared to take off, the aircraft taxied down the designated route to runway 10 right. The aircraft was directed onto the taxiway by ground controllers who were responsible for guiding it to the runway. However, unbeknownst to both the flight crew and the ground controllers, there was a fatal misunderstanding. Due to the construction work on the airport's main runway, runway 10 right had been closed off to incoming flights. The runway had not been fully cleared for use and was not properly marked for takeoff. Additionally, construction vehicles and airport workers were present on the runway, creating an added layer of confusion for the crew of Singapore Airlines Flight 006. Despite the signs that should have indicated the runway closure, Captain Ching and his crew were not immediately aware of the danger. Flight 006 was cleared by air traffic control for takeoff on the designated runway. However, what the crew didn't realize was that they had mistakenly turned onto an adjacent taxiway that led directly onto runway 10 left. Runway 10 left was not the intended runway for takeoff, and worse still, it was an active runway that was being used by incoming flights. The crew was now lined up for takeoff on the wrong runway, completely unaware of the impending disaster. As Singapore Airlines Flight 006 began its takeoff roll down the wrong runway, there were several critical moments that would later be revealed as key to the disaster. First, the ground controllers who were guiding the aircraft down the runway did not notice the mistake immediately. The runway markings were poorly lit due to the ongoing construction, and visibility was limited due to the darkness of the night. The construction work had obscured any obvious markers that would have warned the crew of their error. As the aircraft hurtled toward takeoff speed, a key warning sign went unnoticed: a Taiwan Mandarin Airlines flight, Flight 642. was on final approach to land on runway 10 left. Taiwan's air traffic control tower was fully aware of the plane's proximity, but did not immediately alert the crew of Flight 006 to the incoming traffic. This failure to communicate the critical danger to the flight crew would prove to be fatal. Captain Ching and his crew had a few seconds to realize the peril they were in. As Flight 006 reached takeoff speed, the crew heard the distant sound of an approaching aircraft. The captain had no idea where the sound was coming from, but the ominous noise began to grow louder. It was at this moment that the collision warning system finally sounded. A mere few seconds after that warning, the aircraft collided with Flight 642, which had been attempting to land on the same runway. The collision between Singapore Airlines Flight 006 and Taiwan Mandarin Airlines Flight 642 occurred with terrifying speed. Flight 642 had been descending, and the flight crew was unaware of the aircraft's location on the runway until it was too late. At around 11:53 p.m., as Flight 006's engines roared in full throttle, Captain Ching attempted to lift the aircraft off the runway. In that split second, both aircraft collided. Flight 006's fuselage was struck by the nose of Flight 642, causing catastrophic damage. The engines of Flight 006 were torn apart, and the aircraft was engulfed in flames. Passengers aboard the Singapore Airlines flight screamed in panic as the heat from the fire consumed the cabin. Despite the catastrophic nature of the crash, there was an extraordinary moment of heroism and quick thinking. Flight attendants and passengers acted swiftly, evacuating the plane as it was engulfed in flames. Some passengers were able to escape through the emergency exits, while others were trapped inside as the fire raged. The impact of the crash was devastating. While many passengers and crew on both flights survived, others were not so fortunate. Tragically, 83 people were killed in the crash, including 79 passengers aboard Singapore Airlines Flight 006. The fire and the injuries sustained during the crash made it impossible for some passengers to escape in time. In the wake of the disaster, there were extraordinary accounts of bravery. Many of the survivors described the selfless actions of the flight attendants, who remained calm and guided passengers to safety. Even as the flames threatened to consume the cabin, they managed to evacuate many people despite the horrific circumstances, but some were unable to escape. Both the flight crew of Flight 006 and the crew of Flight 642 faced a dire situation. Fortunately, the flight crew aboard Flight 642 managed to land safely without injury. Though the psychological toll on both the Mandarin Airlines and Singapore Airlines crews was immense, the trauma of witnessing the crash, the loss of life, and the aftermath of the event weighed heavily on all involved. The aftermath of the crash led to an extensive investigation by Taiwan's aviation authorities, as well as the Singaporean government and the Civil Aviation Administration. As investigators pieced together the puzzle, they uncovered a tragic series of miscommunications, errors, and lapses in judgment that had led to the crash. One of the most critical findings was that the flight crew of Singapore Airlines Flight 006 had failed to notice the runway markings, indicating that runway 10 left was closed for construction. There was a distinct lack of clarity in the signage and lighting that should have warned the crew of the closure. Additionally, ground controllers failed to notice that the aircraft had mistakenly taxied onto the wrong runway. Finally, the failure of air traffic control to alert the crew to the incoming flight during its approach to land was deemed a major oversight that contributed to the tragedy. Although these systemic errors were ultimately identified, the real tragedy of the crash lay in the fact that it had been preventable. A series of small, avoidable mistakes led to an outcome no one had ever anticipated. In the wake of the crash, Singapore Airlines faced a difficult road ahead. While the airline continued to be one of the safest and most respected carriers in the world, the crash was a blow to its reputation. The disaster forced airlines worldwide to re-evaluate their runway safety measures, airport construction protocols, and crew training. One of the key recommendations that came out of the investigation was a revision of airport construction procedures, with stricter regulations regarding signage, lighting, and runway markings. The crash also led to improvements in communication between flight crews and air traffic control, with new protocols put in place to ensure better coordination in the event of emergency situations or runway confusion. The families of the victims, many of whom had lost loved ones on that fateful night, struggled with the enormity of their loss. Singapore Airlines established a fund to support the families of the victims, and the airline's commitment to ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again became a hallmark of its recovery.